President Obama's in full damage control mode tonight. My next guest knows all about that. Lanny Davis is the author of Crisis Tales, 5 Rules for Coping with Crisis in Business, Politics and Life. He's also, of course, a former special counsel to President Clinton and the founder of Purple Nation Solutions. And he joins me on the grill. It couldn't be a more appropriate night to have you roasting on that grill, Lanny. What a mess the president finds himself in from all fronts this week. Let's start with this IRS scandal. Has the White House handled this properly, do you think?
Well, maybe B+, but I'm mystified by the legalistic language. The president should be on camera, in person, expressing outrage, calling for an investigation of his own White House to get out in front of what the Republicans are clearly going to do. Being out in front meaning preempt what you know is coming. And also, I think a bipartisan committee of Congress should be organized to investigate everyone who might have touched this. If this were a Republican president, we went back to Richard Nixon with abuse of power by the IRS against political enemies, Democrats would be shouting for that kind of investigation. I'm hoping that the president will follow the crisis management rule to preempt and show more anger and passion rather than a very legalistic statement. I'm glad he made it, but I think it could have been less legalistic.
And Jay Carney got a bit of a beating up by the White House press team today, and not really surprising because the language he was using seemed to be softening in terms of absolute certainty that nobody at the White House knew about this. Is it really feasible, do you think, that the IRS would independently be so overtly political against the Republicans and Tea Party in particular without anybody at the White House having at least had a quiet word?
Sure, I think it's possible, but they have a presumption that they have to overcome. The public presumes that the White House must have known. The Watergate scandal led to a law that prohibits the White House from communicating with the IRS on any topic such as political targeting. So it's possible. But what's lacking here is a preemptive mode. I don't see the president calling for a congressional investigation, a White House investigation, where everyone in the White House is asked, emails are looked at, did you communicate with anyone regarding this matter, even indirectly? And it certainly is a presumption that they have to overcome. But of course, I believe them if they say there is no such contact, but they've got to prove it. And by proving it, I mean transparency.
This is among, if not the most serious, it is within the top 2 or 3 most serious leaks that I've ever seen. It put the American people at risk, and that is not hyperbole.
Using the strongest possible terms, that's Attorney General Eric Holder on the stunning revelation that the Justice Department seized phone records from the Associated Press. Holder, under fire for this scandal, says he's announcing a criminal investigation. Back on the grill tonight is Lanny Davis. Lanny, before we come to that, one final question that struck me in the break there about the IRS. Should there be proof that emerges that somebody at the White House knew that the IRS were targeting the Tea Party and so on, how serious would that be?
Well, first of all, I think it's a crime. It's extremely politically serious. I would have liked the president to have used the words of somebody whose name I won't mention, "You're fired," if anybody in my shop does that. And we remember that President Bush promised to do that, and he didn't do that when it came to the whole issue of Valerie Plame and the exposure on that. And yet there were people in the White House who knew about that who weren't fired. So the word is "you're fired," and it should come from the President of the United States. This is very serious. We went through Watergate and abuse of power. Every Democrat should be as concerned about this as if it were a Republican president, and that's the test of crisis management. Do you apply the same standard of transparency and being proactive? And I've had words about the way the White House handled the Benghazi matter, as well as now this AP story is very troubling.
Well, let's come to the AP story. Eric Holder, very strong today, saying that it was an extraordinary leak, the worst he could remember, basically, posing a great threat to the lives of Americans. Does that in itself justify what they did in terms of basically going after the Associated Press and potentially checking the records for up to 100 journalists?
Well, full disclosure, I'm not only a friend but a great admirer of Eric Holder's for many, many years. So I have to trust that in his judgment that this was necessary. Having said that, again, purely as a matter of crisis management, I don't have any facts as to why it was so broad. there's a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome to violate First Amendment principles, which is what you're doing when you're issuing subpoenas for telephone records of something like the Associated Press or a major media organization. I'd like to hear the Attorney General, if he can, maybe he can't, tell us why was it so broad? Could it have been narrower if there was a serious crime? And I believe him when he says it. I don't have enough information yet to explain to me why it was so broad that it could deter First Amendment principles, in my judgment.
One of the problems, it seems to me, is that he recused himself from this decision-making process and therefore felt today he couldn't even talk about it because he wasn't the guy who took these decisions, basically chucking his number two under the bus, you might argue. But there are serious questions to be answered here, and I suppose it really comes down to, was what they did actually legal?
Well, there is a ground for subpoenaing documents, and in a case of a crime, yes, it's certainly justifiable. Whether it's good policy and whether their ability to communicate and explain what is such a radical departure in a broad subpoena. The subpoena that I looked at or read about, I've never seen such a thing applied to a news organization. So at least if Eric Holder's recused himself, where is the Justice Department explaining this? Even if people disagree, what crisis management is about is explaining the facts, even if they're not good facts. I don't hear any explanation. Mr. Machen, the U.S. Attorney, gave a most inadequate explanation with conclusory sentences with no explanation as to the breadth, the scary breadth that really chills First Amendment conduct that he should have explained, which should be explained to all of us tomorrow morning.
Right. The other thing I want to repeat again is that when they accuse the AP of being irresponsible in terms of this leak, in reality, the AP, when they were asked to, actually backed off the story and held off at the request of the government. So when you have an organisation like AP behaving like that, to then go after them in this way seems extremely prohibitive to me, and I just find it unacceptable.
Look, I do want to spend 1 minute about Benghazi because it's very similar. It's the absence of communication that is the serious problem in any crisis. No matter how bad the facts are, once you put the facts out, take the talking points, for example. Now that we've seen all the versions of the talking points, we now realize that the CIA originally came up with the expression spontaneous protest inspired by the events in Cairo, meaning the anti-Muslim videotape. That sentence, written by the CIA, stayed with all 14 versions, never changed. Yet the Republican attack is actually contradicted when you read those talking points.
Except that, Lanny, let me jump in. I mean, that may be true, but they removed any reference to al-Qaeda as being a potential source of this problem too. It's that the Republicans are going after, and I think they have a right to do that, don't they?
Well, they certainly did remove those references. Whether they were removed by the CIA or whether they were removed by people in the State Department is unclear. But the attack point, and I do agree that that's troubling, but those talking points should have been put out months ago, and the removal of that phrase should have been explained. I'm not justifying the removal, but the Republicans focused on the words spontaneous demonstration inspired by Cairo, and I learned for the first time that that never changed from the CIA's first formulation.
Right,
I'm not justifying the removal. But why not communicate that right up front? Well,
I agree with you, but I think the problem is the removal of the al-Qaeda reference was being seen as a deliberate action by people in the administration to avoid that being the narrative, that al-Qaeda was still active and killing American ambassadors and other staff. And I think you put it all together with the IRS targeting the Tea Party, the Benghazi issue of these talking points and al-Qaeda references being removed, the AP being targeted by the Justice Department in what many consider to be an outrageous manner. You put it all together and you have a real breach of trust in President Obama and his administration, don't you?
So look, yes, there's a breach of trust because of the opaqueness of the way the White House has handled, at least starting with the talking points. I'm troubled by some of the changes that occurred. I'd like to know who made the changes and what the motive was, of course. But you do that up front. You do that yourself. If you're in the White House, you take those talking points. There's nothing classified there that I could tell. And you put them out, and then you try to explain, and you're transparent. If there are troubling answers, those answers are just as troubling, but they're made more so because they were opaque about it. And I do contrast the way Secretary of State Clinton took personal responsibility, no ifs, ands, or buts. It happened on her watch, this terrible tragedy. She commissioned a study that concluded that there was a systemic failure of leadership in her department, and she immediately implemented those recommendations. I may be biased because I'm known to be a friend of Mrs. Clinton. The fact is, she stood up to the line, no ifs, ands, or buts, no explanations. She accepted responsibility and did it herself rather than waiting to be forced to do it, as we've seen in this instance regarding the talking points.
Lanny Davis, always good to talk to you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.